Hello and welcome to podcast.init, the podcast about Python and the people who make it great. When you're ready to launch your next app or want to try a project you hear about on the show, you'll need somewhere to deploy it, so take a look at our friends over at Linode. With 200 gigabit private networking, scalable shared block storage, node balancers, and a 40 gigabit public network, all controlled by a brand new API, you've got everything you need to scale up. And for your tasks that need fast computation, such as training machine learning models, they just launched dedicated CPU instances. And they also have a new object storage service to make storing data for your apps even easier. Go to pythonpodcast.com/linode, that's Linode today, to get a $20 credit and launch a new server in under a minute. And don't forget to thank them for their continued support of this show. And you listen to this show to learn and stay up to date with the ways that Python is being used, including the latest in machine learning and data analysis. For even more opportunities to meet, listen, and learn from your peers, you don't want to miss out on this year's conference season. We have partnered with organizations such as O'Reilly Media, Corinium Global Intelligence, ODSC, and Data Council. Upcoming events include the Software Architecture Conference, the Strata Data Conference, and PyCon US. Go to pythonpodcast.com/conferences to learn more about these and other events, and take advantage of our partner discounts to save money when you register today. Your host as usual is Tobias Macy, and today I'm interviewing Tom Christie about his work on Django REST Framework, Starlit, Async in Python, Encode, and all of the other areas that he's been involved with over the past few years. So, Tom, can you start by introducing yourself?
Hi, yeah, sure. My name's Tom. I'm currently working on open source software full-time. I'm running a small, at the moment, one-person business called Encode. I'm working on all manner of things Python web-related.
And do you remember how you first got introduced to Python?
Sure. So, well, I say sure. I'm not sure that I completely do, because I've been in the game long enough that it's gotten slightly woolly. At some point along the line, it went from, oh, this language, see, this new thing seems nice. This looks like a much better way to do the stuff that I'm currently doing with Perl and Bash scripts. I think it was probably when I was working for a content distribution network, and all of a sudden, having been used to working with Perl and Bash scripts or with C, there was suddenly this new language just appeared on the scene for me, and it was just so productive and so nice to work with. Yeah, like that. But as I say, long enough ago now that I'm not entirely sure quite when it was.
Yeah, it's definitely interesting to try and catalog back of how did that get started. I know I started in Python pretty early in my career, but I don't remember exactly how I first came across it. So
Right.
I don't blame you for not remembering the specifics.
What got you into programming in the first place?
So I actually ended up getting my degree in computer engineering, and so that was my first introduction to actually writing code, and my first class was in C++, so by the time I got to Java in the next semester, I said, oh my gosh, this is so concise and easy to write. And then as I got
Python
introduced to more dynamic languages,
along.
Well, actually, it was I first got introduced to Ruby because I was working at a place that did Ruby on Rails, and it just never really sunk in and never stuck. And somehow or other, I ended up with Python. I think because I was working as a sysadmin and just trying to figure out like what are all these things doing. Once I actually figured it out, that was the one that really fit my brain and stuck, and that's the one I've been working with for the past 10 years or so now.
Yeah. I mean, when I was first going, it was all lots and lots of back-end stuff, working in C and C++, and I moved into the web space as I progressed, because I wanted to get more of that. But I want to be able to build things that I can see, and I want to be able to, actually build services. And when you're working in very, very back-end centered stuff, like I did a lot of speech recognition and then lots of core networking stuff, and you're always part of this much, much bigger company, and you're always building stuff that feels so far away from the customer that then moving into Python and the web space just felt so much more enabling. I can actually build stuff and put it out there and show people.
Yeah, definitely useful to be able to have something that you can point to, particularly if you're talking to somebody of what is it that you do? You can say, I build
Yeah.
that. Because
Yes.
otherwise it's, oh, I build things that do this other thing that you might use, 3 or 4 steps removed.
Yes. Although it's still difficult describing it at the moment because most people, people will say, well, what is it that you build or what do you do? So, well, I build software for people who build software.
Yeah, exactly.
That's about as close as I can get.
And in talking to people in the Python community, there are a few different eras, particularly in the web, that people have come in on. So some people will have cut their teeth on Zope, other people will have come in more in the Django era. Where were you in that overall journey of Python and the web when you first started getting involved in it?
I think Django was pretty much my first web framework that I started working on Python with. Um, Yeah, and it wasn't really that long since I'd been working with Django before I had the idea for, oh, here's this neat API framework that I'd like to build. Um, yeah, I, I got some contracting position for a little Django job somewhere first, and I just moved to Brighton, and I was just noodling away on that, and then started working on this side project.
And so that has become Django REST Framework, which is now sort of the de facto standard for people who want to build well structured REST APIs in Django. So I'm wondering if you can talk a bit about some of the history there of how it came to be and how it came to be so popular.
Yeah, sure. Well, it's been quite a long time now, so it's been going for I think more than 10 years. The original impetus for the project was this thought of why is it that we're building all of these web APIs, but they're not, you can't interact with them natively in a web browser? Why are these web APIs not web browsable? And I had a few little thoughts about, well, how would we approach this? And I looked at a couple of the existing projects in Django. I think it was Piston was the big one that was around at the time, way back, and thought, oh no, I can't quite make it work with this. I'll just start my own thing in order to show how you would do this. And I was so keen on the idea of web browsable web APIs that it was this big motivation to kind of keep improving the project to try to get the idea out there. And it carried on and it carried on. And Tasty Pie was really for a long time kind of more feature complete than REST framework, but just kept plugging away on it. And then got a little bit lucky with the timing because at some point I kind of thought, okay, I can see how I'd like the next version of this to look. And the timing just happened to be right that there was kind of a big enough need for it in the community so that when we ran a very first Kickstarter for it, that ended up being pretty successful. We raised like £30,000. I was working with a small company called DabApps who were really keen on the idea of doing this. So we organized the Kickstarter together, and they said, "Oh, okay, if you make this much money, you'll be able to allocate that much of your working time on it." So even though I was working in a full-time job, we managed to figure out a nice way to make a Kickstarter work and be able to free up a bunch of time. And that really progressed the project massively from there. Then a few years later, I thought, okay, well, I can see what I'd like to do for the next tranche of work on this. And I was thinking about how am I going to approach this? Am I going to do another Kickstarter or so? I didn't really want to do that because really what I wanted was a revenue model that was ongoing rather than one great big lump sum of, right, here's a chunk of money, go and do a bunch of work. And again, kind of got lucky with the timing because Mozilla had just released their big open source grants program, and Mozilla happened to use Django REST Framework. So I applied to Mozilla from one of these grants, and at the same time was thinking, okay, well, I'd really like to launch a recurring model. And when we were successful and the Mozilla grant came in, that gave me enough runway to be able to say, okay, I'm going to give this a shot. Let's launch an ongoing funding program for it. So I stepped away from my job, and I knew that I had 6 to 9 months of safety cushion, and launched the recurring sponsorship model with Encode. And I've been working funded by that for the last 3 years or so, 3.5 years.
From your work on Django REST Framework, I know that that is still an ongoing project and one that's still supported, but with the introduction of asynchronous capabilities in the core Python runtime, I know that you also decided to revisit what APIs mean in that landscape, and that took the form of Starlit. So I'm wondering if you can talk a bit about what the Starlit project is and how your work on Django REST Framework influenced your thinking with this new project, and how the two sort of play off of each other or relate to each other or not.
Yeah, sure. So I could see that there were lots of new async web frameworks coming up. And Andrew Godwin was also working in this area and had introduced, or was just starting to talk about introducing ASGI. So you have WSGI, which is the interface layer between the servers, such as Gunicorn, and the web frameworks. And it provides this really nice separation that means you don't have to really be concerned at all with any of the gnarly stuff that the web server has to do when you're in application space. And WSGI is designed to work with thread concurrency standard threaded concurrency programs. And when async came along, there was this new need for something similar, but in the async space, that was able to additionally, as well as handling HTTP, also be able to handle WebSockets and various other stuff like long-running HTTP requests that are streaming data back down, and other stuff, like dealing with background tasks more gracefully. Yeah, so Andrew Godwin had started working on ASGI in order to bring some async capabilities into Django through Django channels. And what I wanted to do was build on the work that he was doing with ASGI and bring that into the wider space of Python web frameworks more generally. So rather than ASGI being just centered on it's this Django initiative, how do we build up a whole web ecosystem, a whole Python async web ecosystem based on ASGI? And Starlit is, right, here's the foundational set of tooling that we'll need in order to be able to do that. And there's a few other projects now where people have then started building higher level web frameworks on top of that, like Fast API, which is fantastic.
Yeah, it's definitely interesting how much of an explosion there is now in new web frameworks that are exploring the async capabilities of Python, where it seemed like for a while it had sort of stabilized around Django and Pyramid and Flask as being sort of the main core of the web ecosystem in Python, with a few different special cases here and there. But now that async is rolled out, and particularly with the new ASGI specification as a standardization that people can orient themselves around, there's a lot more activity happening, and new frameworks seem like they're coming out maybe every few weeks. So it's definitely interesting to revisit the web space in this new landscape of asynchronous capabilities, and how that plays into the performance characteristics and the language choices that people are making. Because for a little while there was a bit of an exodus to things like Go or Node because of the native async capabilities, and now that that's built back into Python, people are starting to maybe come back into the fold and rethink about what it means to write a web application in Python.
Yeah. And I don't really know how much that message has gotten out, but I think it's it's been the landscape, the async web landscape in Python has been coming along really, really quickly. And for me, one of the big things that I try to promote with it is that it's all about trying to hit a sweet spot between for Python for both productivity and performance, as well as I'm starting to look at, well, what cool stuff can we build that's making use of WebSockets, and how can we make better use of neat real-time stuff that we can plug into our web applications as well, which is going to be really interesting too.
And digging more into the funding and sustainability model of the work that you're doing on Starlit and work within the ASCII ecosystem, you mentioned before that you had a couple of experiences of things like Kickstarter or this grant application for getting lump sums to support your development, as well as doing freelance work. I'm wondering what your current thinking is on the overall sustainability of open source as a business model and as an individual contributor, and what your current hopes and goals are with the Encode organization as a umbrella for doing all of this work.
A bit hard to say wider. I can talk about my experience. At the moment, Encode just about manages. So we have a pretty simple model. There's 3 different tiers that companies can sign up to, and the monthly recurring revenue that we get from that is just about enough to cover a salary for myself. I think ideally, I would like Encode to find a way to bring in another revenue stream as well on top of the sponsorships. I've got some thoughts about something that we could bring into the product space there, perhaps, that is still an open source product. But so, for example, in the way that Sentry managed to both remain an open source product and yet massively succeed as a company, I think those are the obvious kind of, if you can do the same sort of thing that they've done, that's where I'd love for. Obviously, I'm not expecting anything on that magnitude for Encode, but I would like to follow their kind of model sometime. Or, the other thing would be just keeping to press for what a solid return on investment the sponsorships offer, and try to get the community as a whole pushing for more of these kinds of models, but with larger amounts involved. Because the pitch that I generally make if I'm on the stage and there's a whole bunch of people out there is, I want to work for your company full time for $100 a month or $150 per month. And I'll be working full time on building out all of the stuff that you're using day after day after day. The stuff that's been built out as a result of Encode being sponsored. Over the last 3 years, there's been Starlit being an ASCII web framework. There's Unicorn being a web server. There's a whole stack of work on Django REST Framework. There's been HTTPX, so a new HTTP client. That so much stuff has come out as a result of the funding, and yet any one individual company, their outlay on that has been minimal compared to the price of paying for a full-time developer. So yeah, maybe trying to push for some higher sponsorship tiers as well might be an option. But I think one of the difficulties for people trying to get into it is it's a lot easier to make the case for sponsorships if you're able to actually free up the time to put in the work as a result, right? So I kind of was very fortunate to be able to get over this hurdle of, right, I've got enough coming in that I can afford to work on this full time. It's much more difficult if you're actually in a full-time job to go, well, how am I going to launch how am I going to make the case for, I'd like your company to give me this amount of money in order for me to keep working on this, when you're only able to ever work on it as a side project and your time's constrained anyway. So getting over that kind of initial jump, I think, is one of the really difficult things as well.
And I find it interesting, too, that you've decided to go about this independently and build your own organization and try and establish these direct relationships with sponsors. And I'm wondering what your thinking is on the benefits of that, at least for yourself, versus going with something like the Tidelift model or the Open Collective model of using the sort of broader reach of these organizations as a means of establishing relationships that you are maybe one step removed from, but still being able to use that as a means of gaining funding.
I mean, first off, I don't think Open Collective existed when we launched the model. It might have done. Tidelift certainly didn't. I'm a bit lukewarm on the Tidelift model because basically it brings in an extra intermediary, and there's already so little cash in the system that I don't particularly want to be paying somebody else to sit between me and the sponsors. But Open Collective, I think, is actually, as it happens, seems to be organized much more similarly to the way that we do our sponsorships. And, Stripe, and also now that GitHub have their own mechanism for getting sponsors to sign up, there isn't actually that much work to do in terms of what infrastructure do you need if you just want to be able to start taking payments from folks. So yeah, having that direct relationship certainly works for me at the moment. There's other things that I would consider as well, like, for HTTPX and some of this, there's a whole load of vital HTTP infrastructure for Python that is really underfunded. And I'd be really interested to see a model where it's not going directly to encode, but instead we got a whole bunch of people together and try to launch the same sort of funding model, but maybe have the funds go directly to the PSF, who could then contract out for work, or something like that. So yeah, I'd be interested in alternatives one day, but certainly having a direct relationship to the sponsors has been quite freeing over the last 3 years. Although I suppose there's one thing that has been a bit of an unknown to me is they were originally launched as Django REST Framework sponsorships, and that's still what they're billed at, and that's still how the package is presented, but that's not where all of my time is dedicated these days. There's Django REST Framework, but there's all the other stuff that I'm doing as well. And should I start calling these Encode OSS sponsorships, and is that a good sell for most of my sponsors or not, is still a bit of an unknown for me. So, but I mean, realistically, that's where it actually is at the moment. So
yeah, marketing and sales are hard.
Yes. Yeah, and branding too.
Absolutely. And in terms of the particular market that you're focusing on, you mentioned earlier that you're spending a lot of your time and energy on the web and the Python ecosystem therein. And we've also mentioned how a lot of your current focus is on some of these different aspects of async within the web context. And for people who are familiar with Python web programming in the context of WSGI and this threaded model where everything is synchronous, what are some of the practices that they need to unlearn, or some of the communal knowledge that is no longer accurate in this new land of async?
I wouldn't exactly say that. I mean, I would bring as much as possible. Django is such a solid kind of best working practices guide that I would say, look to how Django does stuff and try to do stuff as similarly as possible to that. The difference is more that because in a lot of cases you're having to build everything up from scratch again, you can revisit some of the finer details of how you're approaching these things, right? So, for example, Starlit, it's built all the way through to try and be a very low complexity stack while still being super capable. But the one thing that I have tried to approach a little bit differently there is trying to build more components that are reusable across different frameworks rather than being tied to a particular framework. So, for example, trying to promote ASCII middleware rather than framework-specific middleware, and trying to promote like pluggable ASCII applications rather than everything being coupled to the framework. So, for example, in Starlit, there's a component which is a static files app, and you can plug this static files app into any ASCII web framework. And also, like the middleware is all just ASCII middleware, so you can plug it into any ASCII framework. The same with the test client. The test client is built to interact with the ASCII interface, so you can use the test client with any ASCII web framework. So trying to improve the interoperability by having components designed kind of at that level.
And another major recent occurrence is the final deprecation of Python 2. And I'm wondering what your thoughts are on how that's going to impact the overall growth and direction of the asynchronous web in Python now that there are fewer people who are going to be trying to maintain backwards compatibility with Python 2, and will free them up to be able to be more forward-looking in their usage of the language and its capabilities.
Not sure, really, although it's been nice moving on from actually like being able to drop support for 3.5. And before that, I think, originally when Starlit, I can't remember whether we were working with 3.4 as well or not, but really it's only from, the more recent set of releases, so certainly 3.6 onwards, have had enough of, there were a few async primitives that weren't there before. I'm going to forget right now, but something like, async generators or some bits and pieces that would be really fiddly to do in earlier versions of 3. So it's been nice seeing Python 3 really start to mature and all the new versions there start to come along.
As you continue down the road of working in these different libraries and the current set of frameworks that you're supporting, and continuing on building a career around open source, what are some of the areas of potential focus that you think are worth more attention and energy for yourself and also just for the broader community?
For myself, where I would really like to be is somewhere is focusing on how do we bridge the gap between framework space and product space. So what I mean when I'm talking about that is, if you've got a team who want to start working on a new, say, web backend at the moment, they've kind of got two options. You can go for a hosted service, something like Firebase, where you're then kind of completely in on that product and you're not really ever going to be able to migrate to anything else. And if there's something that the product doesn't do, then you're kind of out of luck. Or you go for something like Rails or Django and you build everything up from scratch. And I think there's this huge space in the middle for how do we start to build more and more evolved frameworks that start off, you can get started with them like a product. So here's the page where you want to start fleshing out your new API, and be able to start plugging a front end into it because there's already a service there that's live and going. But okay, you want to take complete control over that and actually get the source code for the thing that's running at the moment and change it and start hosting it yourself. Well, here's this big button over here that will let you do that, so that we're giving developers this really nice, easy on-ramp to get productive really, really quickly, but without locking them into a particular product space as well. So that's kind of where I'd really like to focus. And I think, like the opportunities there that I would like to try and tackle, stuff in the API space, in the real-time APIs in particular, and both GraphQL and REST as well, because I still see so much potential for improvement in the standard REST web APIs that are being built out and improving that space. So.
And another area that seems to have been one of the slowest to develop, particularly in the asynchronous environment, is the database connection and being able to handle that in an asynchronous fashion. And I know that you've got the ORM library that's looking to tackle that problem. So I'm wondering what your thoughts are on some of the inherent challenges in that space, and then just some of the direction that you think that can go, and some of the directions that you'd like to see it go as far as being more widely adopted and more ubiquitous to remove some of these different layers of synchronicity in the overall process flow for these web applications.
I guess there's a couple of different things, right? When I first started looking at the existing asynchronous database drivers, there wasn't really a standardized interface for those. So when you're working with Django, if you want to switch to a different database, you just need to switch the database URL in your settings, and in a whole bunch of cases, that's going to be the only thing that you need to do. Otherwise, everything's transparent, and you might be running your tests against SQLite, but in production and staging, you're on Postgres, although the application code looks exactly the same in both cases. So trying to build layers of interfacing with this stuff in the way that you're not locked into, right, this is the one particular async database driver that I'm using, but instead let's have a sensible level for interacting with the database that doesn't need to know about those, and just be able to plug in whichever database driver we want underneath that, or swap out to a different one if there's some particular gnarly problems with it and we want to use something else. So that, and then trying to introduce really nice modularity in the different layers of concern. So I've got two different projects. There's databases, which is the kind of lower level. We just want to execute SQL Alchemy core statements. And then there's ORM on top of that, which is how do we then build a kind of a fully featured ORM on top of that. So trying to look at nice layering, and also, again, how do we approach this in a way that's not framework specific, right? So the Django ORM, if I was working in the sync space, would be kind of my preferred choice, because I just find it like the easiest thing to work with. But I find it a bit of a shame, or I think it would be lovely to have a project that's as mature as that, but isn't specifically tied to one particular framework. And that's not even always because I want to choose to use it with a different framework, but sometimes it's because, well, if I want to go and understand how this component works, if I know that it's properly bounded, then I've got this kind of one set of stuff that I need to look at, and I don't need to think about, oh, is there something magic in Django settings that's changing this thing, or do I need to look at how this other module interacts with that? So it's just about kind of keeping the complexity nicely bounded at each different level.
Yeah, it's definitely nice being able to treat different layers in isolation without having to try and figure out what are all the additional layers sitting on top of it that are actually manipulating the request along the way, or adding different context that I have to try and figure out how to fit into my head to be able to comprehend the overall flow of what's happening.
And it doesn't make sense to do these things with Django or Django's ORM because they're so mature and they're in their space. But when you happen to have a great big new green space that needs building up anyway, that's the time to that's the time to do it.
And are there any other aspects of your work with the encode organization, or your work in the web space and async in general, or any of the other aspects of the Python language or community or your career that you're focusing on that we didn't discuss yet that you'd like to cover before we close out the show?
Well, I guess there's HTTPX is the newest project that I've been working on. Haven't talked a lot about that today. So that's a new HTTP client where we're aiming for feature parity with requests, but also adding support for both sync and async APIs with it, and also bringing support for both HTTP 1.1 and HTTP 2. So that's the big thing that I'm working on at the moment. And other than that, we'll see what comes next.
Yeah, the HTTPX project is definitely pretty ambitious given the ubiquity of requests across the entire community. So I'm wondering what your thoughts are on the API design of requests, as far as, is it a benefit to you because you don't have to think about that interface and you can think about just the plumbing of things, or is it acting as a constraint because maybe there are different things that you want to be able to do because of the async capabilities that you're adding in?
It's massive benefit. It's easy to kind of take for granted, but it takes away so many places where you would otherwise have an open API design question, and you go, okay, well, I don't really have to. I mean, it was quite involved trying to figure out the right way to approach bringing both an async and a synchronous API to that. And there are a few places where it diverges from requests because of that, but not having to kind of think about all of the rest of that space has been really helpful.
And are you keeping an eye on what's going on with the HTTP 3 standard that they're trying to introduce right now? And what are your thoughts on the just sort of direction that the web is moving?
Yeah, so Jeremy Lane is doing a whole bunch of work on that, and we've been chatting, and yes, I can see HTTP 3 support coming to the HTTPX library at some points. I don't know whether there's necessarily as much benefit in Python or other dynamic languages as there might be in other different contexts. Like you need to actually look at because it's more compute intensive, right? So there might not be as much benefit for Python as there would in some very, very lower level languages. But yes, I can definitely see it coming to HTTPX at some point, and it'll be a case of looking at the evidence for seeing, well, how much difference does this make? And it's more likely that it would be, look, here's this optional thing that we have at some point in the future that if you want, you can try it out and give it a go and see, does this make a difference in your case? And it's likely to just be some more specific kinds of use cases where it actually makes a difference for users.
Yeah, it's definitely interesting to see how the web has sort of accelerated its evolution, where we had HTTP 1.1 for decades, and then all of a sudden there's HTTP 2, and then only a few short years later they're trying to add a new protocol on top of everything else.
Yeah. And I think it's worth folks as well taking quite a balanced view onto it as well. Even going from HTTP 1.1 to HTTP 2 I think, there's so much extra complexity that brings, and it should definitely be treated as okay, let's try using this. Does it actually improve things or not? Don't just blindly go, oh wow, HTTP2, that sounds snazzy. That's got to definitely be the thing that we ought to be using, right? So yeah, I kind of have slightly mixed feelings about the ever-growing complexity of HTTP. And HTTP 1.1 has enough gnarly edge cases in it anyway.
Well, for anybody who wants to follow along with your work or get in touch, I'll have you add your preferred contact information to the show notes. And so with that, I'll move us into the picks. And this week, I'm going to choose a couple of movies that I watched with my kids recently. The first was a movie called Abominable that was just very well done, visually appealing and humorous, about a group of kids who are trying to get an abominable snowman across China back to his home in the Himalayas.
Cool.
And the other one is Maleficent, Mistress of Evil, which is a sequel to the original Maleficent movie, which is taking a different view of the Sleeping Beauty story and giving it a bit of a spin. So just very well done visually, good storyline. Had a lot of fun watching that as well with the kids. So if you're looking for something to watch, definitely worth checking out either of those. And so with that, I'll pass it to you, Tom. Do you have any picks this week?
All right, sure. So out of nowhere, let's go for The Lobster, which is just a very strange film. That's all I'll say about it. Strange and sometimes funny, quite dark. Yeah, I won't say anything about it. It's just odd. And something that I've just about finished reading recently, a book, The Master and His Emissary, I've found really, really interesting. It's about the two different hemispheres of the brain and the author's particular take on the kind of the cultural implications of what the two different hemispheres each focus on and what their kind of the world view that each of the hemispheres has. So, and that's The Master and His Emissary by Ian McGilchrist.
I'll definitely have to take a look at that. Well, thank you very much for taking the time today to join me and share your experience of working in the web context with Python and delving into async, and your experience of approaching sustainability of open source. Definitely a lot of complex and interesting topics. So I'm glad that you are making progress and having success with those. And I hope you enjoy the rest of your day.
Cheers. Thank you so much, Tobias.
Thank you for listening. Don't forget to check out our other show, the Data Engineering Podcast, at dataengineeringpodcast.com for the latest on modern data management. And visit the site at pythonpodcast.com to subscribe to the show, sign up for the mailing list, and read the show notes. And if you've learned something or tried out a project from the show, then tell us about it. Email hosts@podcastinit.com with your story. To help other people find the show, please leave a review on iTunes and tell your friends and coworkers.